So anyway, let me start again and say thank you, Meta, very much for the invitation. And I am truly delighted to be here. I'm very keen on science for peace in general and related themes. And Meta is very kindly invites me to a whole lot of stuff. The trouble is I don't live in Toronto. I actually commute from far out of town. And I'm never here when anything good is going on. I hope something good is going on tonight, and that's a rare exception, but it's unusual for me to be here at these sorts of times. Okay, let's launch into this. Now, my first slide points out that every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But there's no reason in the world why they have to be in that order. So I'm going to start with the end, my conclusion. And my conclusion is simply this: we need to socialize medical research. Now, there's a certain at least one person will agree with me. Well, actually, I know if it's a Science for Peace crowd, it's a pack of lefties anyway, right? So why am I even bothering? So the thing is, what might be lost in a kind of dramatic build-up to a conclusion is lost. But you'll see the point of the examples as I go along. They'll sort of be, the motivation will be obvious for them. And then when I repeat the conclusion, I hope it'll be sort of, oh, how obvious by this point. Okay? So that was the end, now the beginning. Okay, so here's our problem. How can we ensure high quality medicine in the light of corporate control of biomedical research with all of its colossal financial conflicts of interest? That's our problem. Of course, it's a medical problem. It's also a kind of political, ethical, and science policy problem. And it's also a problem in the methodology of science, or the philosophy of science. Okay? So it involves all of those things. Now here's a kind of outline, brief outline of the sorts of things that I'm going to talk about. So I want to talk about antibiotics, the corrupting influences of corporate ownership, some stuff about clinical trials. I could mention ghostwriting, skewed research aims, rigid methodology, failure of the attempt to regulate the industry. And by regulate, I mean leave it in private hands, but just have, you know, very strict rules and guidelines for them to follow. And how these have been really quite a failure. And then finally, repeat the solution, which is what I gave you at the very, very beginning. Okay? So first to antibiotics. All right, so if you're my age, you lived through the golden age of antibiotics. When I was a kid, doctors used to make house calls. Do you remember that? Some of you might remember that. And when I was a kid, I dreaded a house call because I knew what it meant. Before anything happened, I had to turn over and get a shot of penicillin in my bum. Doctor didn't even say a word. He just said, turn over. And then he said, now, what's wrong with you? And antibiotics were that liberal, but by God, they worked well. As I say, it was the golden age. There were so many antibiotics there. They were extremely powerful and effective at the time. New ones were coming on stream that were even better, and so on. But that's changed. In spite of all the research that's happened, the situation with antibiotics is actually much worse today than it was in 1950. And the problem is entirely due to Darwin. It's the extensive use of these antibiotics has led to the evolution of various bacteria, so that now the bacteria themselves can cope with these antibiotics and are now thriving. They're not taking care of it at all. Gonorrhea was a truly terrible socially transmitted problem up until penicillin, and then suddenly it wasn't a problem anymore. If you notice the symptoms of gonorrhea, you just had a shot, and there it goes. But now we're down to a single antibiotic that will treat gonorrhea, and in a few years that will not work anymore. And gonorrhea will make a comeback as a serious socially transmitted disease. Usually the sexual revolution is, the cause of the sexual revolution is usually said to be the pill. Women could control their fertility with the pill. But there's actually two reasons. The other reason, the pill story I think is right. The other story is antibiotics. Gonorrhea was controllable. Suddenly people could have sex with a lot of partners and not worry about gonorrhea. Well, now you're going to actually have to start worrying about it. Okay, anyway, what about the situation? The situation in antibiotics in general. It is getting worse, and the problem is market medicine. Is it actually exacerbating the situation and making it much worse than it might otherwise be? Okay, so when you think about profit-driven medicine, capitalist medicine, the market model for medical research and so on, what do you think of? Well, you think of a corporation that is maybe highly innovative. They're out there, you know, trying to discover new products, and when they have something to sell to us, they sell like mad, and they want maximum use and maximum sales and everything like that. That's what you would expect from somebody who's making cars or anything else. Okay? They'll want to use their product if they've got new uses for their product that haven't been used before, but it's going to increase sales. They're all in favor of it. They'll promote it, they'll advertise it, they'll push it, and so on. And this is what happens with antibiotics. But the trouble is, each of those ingredients contributes enormously to the problem of overuse. This is the real problem with antibiotics. It's the problem of overuse. So what can we do? Okay, everyone agrees, and surprisingly, even the drug companies agree, that this is a market failure. So even people involved, seriously involved in the drug company, who are halfway reasonable, will allow that this is one place where the market cannot solve the problem. That this is a market failure in the technical economic sense. That the solution, that the market situation is actually a disaster. It's exactly what we do not want or need. Because of all of the natural properties for free enterprise medicine, it leads to this overuse, and we need some other way of dealing with it. We get some pretty, when you hear about the problems, you get some pretty dramatic statements of what awaits us. Dame Sally Davies is the chief English medical officer, and she uses the word apocalyptic in connection with this problem. Okay? Now, if free enterprise cannot solve this problem, then who should step in? All right? I leave that as a rhetorical question. I've already answered it. All right. Now I want to talk about something else. Bias and corruption in research. So here's a study, what's sometimes called a meta-study by Beckelman. And what Beckelman does is look at a whole lot of studies involving the connection between what a publication advocates and who's paying for the research. And so this will be in testing, various kinds of testing of products where, you know, the test could turn out positive or negative in principle when you start the test. But it turns out that once the test is published, it is overwhelmingly likely that it will be supporting the payer of the research. This is putting it very mildly, but here's their very restrained conclusion. Financial relations among industry, scientific investigators, and academic institutions are widespread. Conflicts of interest arising from these ties can influence biomedical research in important ways. The data they actually dig up would merit a much stronger statement than that. They're just being super cautious. Joel Lection, who's in Toronto, by the way, he's at York. He teaches at York, and he's also makes sure he's a practicing doctor. He works as an emergency ward emergency room doctor. He's extremely good on a lot of these topics. Here's a big study that he and some others did, published in the British Medical Journal. He got very similar findings to Beckelman. When we put these together, what we can do is, and do the arithmetic, what we find is that the likelihood is about 4 times as great that the sponsor of the trial will get an outcome favorable to the sponsor. We can find similar results in a study by Sismondo. Okay. So what can we do? Can we require better testing? Okay, is that it? We just need better tests. Or do we need to enforce existing conflict of interest rules? Maybe we need to do that. Maybe we just need to tighten up, our various regulations that are in place. Maybe we just need to do that. Or we could do something else entirely, like this. Okay, now, this is a really interesting problem. It's a kind of general philosophical problem, the one I'm going to talk to you now, but it's really important when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry. All right, so pharmaceutical research is in one respect, regardless of who's controlling it, whether it's in public hands or in private hands, it really is a different kind of research than most scientific research. Philosophers are guilty of picking examples that have the following kind of character. We talk about, we are very interested in how, say, physics works, and very interested in how experimentation works in connection with physics in general. And a lot of our examples tend to be very like tabletop experiments. Something like Newton, shining light through the window. It goes through a prism, it breaks up into the spectrum, and he draws certain conclusions about that. This is a kind of classic tabletop experiment, in which case, anyone can do this. You can do this at home. You can do what Newton did at home. And we're interested in the relation of that to the theory and stuff like that. The trouble is, when we focus on examples like that, we forget examples like this. And because of the size of this is what I call one-shot science. This is an experiment that cannot be replicated. It's not a logical problem, it's a financial problem. And the problem has to do with costs. It costs about 800, this is what drug companies say, that it costs around 800 million, maybe it's up to $1 billion, maybe even over $1 billion now, is their claim about the cost of bringing a drug to trial. Okay? Some pharmaceutical product to trial in the $1 billion range. That's a lie. It's actually down around 100 to maybe even as much as 200 million. But the thing is, even the lower number is horrific. It's not the sort of thing you can just replicate at home. It's very, very different. And it means that the kind of research that's going on has to be evaluated in different ways than we normally do. So unlike the Newton, and the light through the spectrum example, or if you're an ordinary working mathematician where you can evaluate a typical theorem published in a math journal, the proof of the theorem might be a page or 2 or even 3, 5 pages long. But the thing is, you can actually work your way through it and evaluate whether or not the proof is a legitimate proof. Does it actually prove the theorem? These are things that the wider community can control and evaluate. But when you do something like this, you can't. It's just out of our hands. And you see it in a couple of cases. You see it here. You also see it in, let me see if I've got it in the next slide. Yeah, the computer example. It's the same problem. There's no problem about commercial interests in the computer example. But let me just mention it to you. So here, there are proofs in math that are computer generated. And so you write some software, you stick it in your computer, it grinds away. You may need a Cray supercomputer, and you may need several thousand hours of computation time. And it will generate the proof. You just write the program telling it what to do. It actually works through the tens of thousands of cases and examines them all and actually proves the theorem, or provides a counterexample to the alleged theorem. How long is the proof? Well, if you actually tried to print it out, it might be millions of pages long. No human being can work through the proof. The proof is simply inaccessible to us. How do we evaluate such a proof? The way a computer proof is evaluated is not by examining the proof. You rather what happens is, what you do is you look at the software program that generated the proof. That's the thing that's humanly manageable. You look at it and say, well, yeah, right, I see how these lines of code would do this, these lines of code here, they would do that. Yeah, it's gonna cover all the cases, I can see it, how it works. That's how you evaluate it. And then you just see what the computer actually generates out, and it gives you a final line, says, ta-da, the theorem is true, or here's a counterexample to it. Nobody, as I say, ever looks at the proof. And because it might take 5,000 hours of Cray supercomputer time, nobody's going to repeat that. That's a one-shot thing. Usually, when mathematicians get a hold of 5,000 hours of Cray supercomputer time, they do it by begging. Say, she runs a physics lab, and on Tuesdays between midnight and 12:30, she's not using her computer. And I say, can I have it for half an hour? Okay, and she kindly condescends to lend me a little time on her computer. And what I do is go begging from all kinds of things like that, and borrow half an hour here, an hour and a half over there. Maybe he's gone on vacation, I get it for a whole week over there, and I can crank out the 5,000 hours or so that I need for the proof. But nobody's going to do that again. Okay? No rival mathematician is going to say, oh gosh, maybe there was, maybe one of those computers actually had a little glitch in it. Let's run the whole thing again to see if it actually works. That's a case of one-shot science too. Okay? So these are both examples of this. There are not many examples in the sciences of this kind of thing. These are hugely expensive. They can be redone in principle, but when we talk about the incredible amounts of money and time and energy and so on, it's really just going to happen once. So this is philosophically really important. Now, in the case of computer proofs, the mathematicians who create the computer proof, what they will provide to the community is the program that generated it. And so people who are maybe a bit skeptical, they can look at it and, and try to evaluate the program. They might criticize it. They might say, look here, this is pretty vague. I can imagine it skipping these kinds of examples. And that might be really good criticism. Or they can work through it and say, yep, I'm won over. I'm pretty confident that this is a good proof. In the case, what are we to do analogously in the case of the pharmaceutical industry? Who are we going to trust when it comes to running clinical trials? Well, we don't trust them. We don't trust them at all. They've got too much money at stake. They've got billions of dollars at stake in potential profits. And so the only solution to this is to simply take it out of their hands. I see no other solution. People have tried solutions such as requiring the registration of clinical trials in advance. And that is a requirement. For most of the leading medical journals, it's an actual requirement. And what that means is that if Eli Lilly or Merck or somebody wants to run a trial on something like blood pressure, and they want to try some new medication, they have to announce that this is what they're doing, this is the way they're going to do it, and so on. They don't have to publish it at the end, but they do have to tell the world that this is what they're up to. And so later on, if they come up with something and publish it, but based on a different study, someone could say, look, these things overlap. I'll bet there's bad data in that first trial that they're not publishing. And then you tell Eli Lilly, we're not going to publish this study here until we see the data from the first study. Okay? So there's a kind of warning there. Well, guess how effective this has been? This was a rule laid down by about 15 of the leading journals, including the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Journal of the American Medical Association, and so on. This is a common rule that they all accepted and said, we're going to impose this upon ourselves. And lo and behold, little more than half of the things that they're publishing now were pre-registered. They're just simply not enforcing their own rules. One of the reasons they're not is because the companies like Merck and Eli Lilly do a lot of advertising. I'm speculating now, of course, that they do a lot of advertising in those journals, and the journals are willing to only go so far in pushing them for the kinds of information that they had officially demanded. Okay? All right.
RCT?
Sorry?
RCT.
Randomized clinical trial. Standard way of running these things. Okay? So anyway, here's the first proposal. All randomized clinical trials should be carried out by a publicly funded neutral agency. So maybe we could create a state-supported agency just to do that, or maybe just fund the universities appropriately to carry out all of these studies. Okay? But take them out of corporate hands. We pay. If Eli Lilly comes to us and says, okay, I think this might work, we've got to be the ones who design the study, execute the study, process the data when it's all over. Our statisticians, not theirs. And we will publish the information when it's over. And we can turn studies, proposed studies down if we wish, thinking they're of no value to the medical community. That would be up to us. And how we deal with patents is I haven't said anything about how to deal with patents, but you want to talk about patents in connection with this, and that's what I'll do later. Okay, well anyway, controlling clinical trials would in fact do a lot to improve the quality of them, but it doesn't touch an awful lot of other aspects of medical research. Okay? So what do most people want? Most people want to just regulate. Whenever they see a problem, well, there's two attitudes. Some people, very, idiots, who are completely, who are, enamored of the market, and they think the market will solve all problems. They say, come on, deregulate. Don't mess around with these highly successful, wonderful companies. Don't hamstring them. And the others just want to regulate. And there's a real problem with with a lot of regulation here. It just doesn't seem to be very effective. And one of the things that it does, or fails to do, is unskew a lot of research. So you can have all the regulations in the world, but it's not going to tackle the following problem, which is not a problem of regulation. It's a problem of what direction are you going to spend your research money in. All right? So here's the typical thing. Imagine yourself owning and seeking profits. You own a pharmaceutical company. You seek profits. Maybe you're chairman of the or CEO for the company, and your mandate is to maximize profits for your shareholders. However you conceptualize yourself, do it. And now think, what are you going to do when faced with decisions about health problems? So here's a health problem, ta-da, and somebody says, oh, I think we can treat this with broccoli. And somebody else says, I think we've got this drug. Well, I've discovered this molecule, and I think we can treat it with this molecule. Are you interested in spending a penny on the broccoli solution? No, you'd be an idiot. You can't patent broccoli. It's already out there. And as soon as people get word that if you eat a little broccoli, you'll solve your health problem, they're sure as hell not going to pay big bucks for some medical solution. There's a kind of solution that free enterprise medicine always looks for, and the only kind of research that they're willing to do is into research that will get them patents, intellectual IP, intellectual property rights, as the result of all of this work. Nothing else is going to motivate them. And in fact, a lot of stuff is, they might want a torpedo. If they hear there's an effective research being done on broccoli, they might try to buy out the little company that's doing it and just shut them down. Okay? So anyway, you skew medical research towards IP right things and away from things like exercise, diet, and so on. What you really want are, the ideal disease is a chronic disease where your patient actually has to take your pill every day for the rest of his life or her life. That's the ideal patient. Vaccines are a real drag. You just get to hit your patient once for royalties. Something you can cure quickly, that's a drag too. It's the ones that you can just sort of go on forever. Blood pressure medicine is wonderful in this regard. So is cholesterol medicine. So is depression medicine, because you just keep those depressed people depressed forever. Don't let them ever cheer up. Just sell them these drugs forever. There's been surprisingly little research done on vaccines in recent years. It's a terrible tragedy. It's bizarre. Anyway, you want to focus your research not only on chronic problems, but on chronic problems of the rich. There's almost no money to be made in malaria research. That's because malaria is caught by poor people in tropical countries. They're very poor. They're not going to be able to pay for this. No, the ideal thing to research is like blood pressure, where you get rich, white, North Americans, rich, white, Europeans. They're the ones who've got the money to pay a hell of a lot for something like blood pressure medicine. There is some work being done on malaria, and I'm no fan of Bill Gates, but much of the research that's actually done on malaria is thanks to the Gates Foundation. There's also research is skewed towards non-health problems. In fact, non-problem. You might even call it a non-problem. And a prime example of this is the drug Serafem to treat PMDD. How many of you have heard of PMDD? Anybody heard of PMDD? PMDD is well, you know of premenstrual syndrome, right? This is the new updated version. This is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And all of you who are female have it. You didn't know you had it, you have it. Okay? And the symptoms are bad every month. And probably for half the month you're feeling these symptoms, and you need to take Serafem daily, forever. Okay? Or at least until menopause. And this is a huge market, as you can imagine. If this is an Eli Lilly product, and guess what? It's exactly Prozac, except for one thing. It's the same quantity, in the same, the same dosage, the same ingredients. Only one thing has changed. Can you guess what has changed? The color. The color has changed. Guess what color it is? No, lavender. But pink's pretty close. Okay. Oh, and by the way, it came online at the same time Prozac became, its patent ran out. Now, what about innovation? Okay. Innovation. You see, a lot of people, whether they like private medicine, private sponsored research or not, will allow, they'll say, well, damn those capitalist buggers. However, I agree, they're pretty good at discovering new things. Surprising a number of people will actually say things like that, including someone I like very much, Catherine DeAngelis, who was the longtime editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association. I met her once at a conference and spent a lot of time with her, and it was really a pleasure. She's a really wonderful woman, and she's very smart, very quick, and she's very socially progressive. She was the one who organized the medical journals of the editors of the leading medical journals into this consortium, who insisted on a whole lot of things like very strong disclosure rules, the registration of trials before they were carried out, and all of those sorts of things. She's really very good. But even she would say, yeah, I know all these problems, blah, 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 but they're so good at innovating. We have so many wonderful products thanks to capitalist medicine. But I began to wonder if this is actually true. How could you evaluate a claim like this? Well, it turns out it's not that hard to evaluate. So let me tell you about some useless research. The US FDA, clearly a flawed organization, but they used to do a few things that were really interesting. And one of them was they kept a private tally, their private evaluation of drugs that they were licensing. Now, the US FDA has a mandate. What they have to do is this. If you've run clinical trials, you say, here are the results, here's my product, I want a license, so I can advertise it and sell it and stuff like that. The FDA is obliged to give you a license provided two things. First, your drug has beat a placebo. It does not have to beat the best alternative available. It only has to beat a placebo. Second, it doesn't have side effects except those that are sort of commensurate with the drug itself. So if you've got a headache medicine but your teeth fall out, not so good. But if it was a chemotherapy and your hair fell out, well, that would be considered, a reasonable trade. So they have to make that kind of judgment. But what they're really interested in is the effectiveness of some of these drugs. And so over a period, that period, 5-year period, 98 to 2002, they had to license 415 new drugs. Okay? Those are 415 drugs that went on the market and they were advertised, and people go to, salespeople go to talk to doctors and so on. In fact, while I think of it, here's a little digression that will interest you. And there's advertising to the public. You see it on, we're not allowed, in Canada we're not allowed to, except a couple of exceptions. Viagra, for some reason the government thinks it's okay to advertise Viagra on Canadian TV. But the ads that you see for drugs are really coming from the US. Okay? So we're swamped with those ads, courtesy of the US, even though you can't advertise officially in Canada. So you've seen a lot of those ads, but not all of these products are advertised on TV. Instead, what salespeople go to, your GP and so on, and try to peddle these drugs. Give a little spiel to your GP or your oncologist or whatever, and try to sell these products. Where do you think these salespeople come from? It's a really interesting question. You would think that, well, they're of course not medical doctors themselves, or they'd be practicing, would probably make a lot more money than being a salesperson. However, you might think, well, at least they had maybe an undergraduate degree in biochemistry or something like that, right? No, not at all. Guess where they come from? The most popular hire for a salesperson for a drug company.
Car dealerships.
Close. Cheerleader. That's right. It's cheerleader. Was that just a lucky guess, or you knew?
I know.
You know. It's amazing. Cheerleaders. It's so stunning. You couldn't make a Hollywood movie and put that in. People say, oh, this is silly, and you'd walk out of the theater. But the truth is bizarre. It's like the Rob Ford saga. You couldn't make it up, you know. All right. So anyway, back to these things. So here's the FDA. Here's the FDA in their own evaluation, which they used to keep on their own website. And out of all of these drugs, 415 drugs, they said 14% were actually good stuff, new innovations, worthwhile stuff. They said another 9% were in fact updated versions of older drugs. But this is good stuff. So roughly a quarter of the things that they had to approve, given their mandate, about a quarter of it they thought was good stuff. And the rest they didn't think was good stuff at all. But they were obliged to license it because of their mandate. And they said of that quarter that they were really no better than existing drugs. It's not that they were bad drugs, it's just that there's already stuff just like it on the market. Now, these last group, the 3/4 of the stuff, they're largely made up of what are called Me Too drugs. And these are sort of versions, slight variations on something that is already selling well. So once Prozac, for instance, hit the market, Prozac was the first of the so-called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And they were these so-called blockbuster selling antidepressant pills. Now, once they hit the thing and they were pulling in, several $1 billion a year in royalties, everybody wanted a piece of the action. So Merck developed something, and Glaxo would develop something, and so on. But these actually are, in fact, if Prozac works, take Prozac. The others actually it's really the same mechanism. It's nothing new. Now, some people will say, Prozac didn't work for me, but Zoloft did work for me. And that happens a little bit of the time. And it may, in fact, be not just some kind of placebo effect, but something due to the, the base of the chemical. Maybe somebody used flour and somebody used sugar. I don't know what. There can be little things that might irritate somebody's stomach and not somebody else's. But nevertheless, the billions of dollars that went into producing this thing is really not worth it at all. We should have just settled for the one drug, assuming it was working. But as I say, the mandate forced the FDA to license them all. Now, during 1 year, the last year of that 5-year period, the FDA approved 78 new drugs. 7, they classified 7 as improvements over old drugs. That is in the first 7 of them were in the first 2 categories. And everything else was a Me Too drug. And notice, of that 7, not a single one of the good drugs was produced by an American corporation. The good stuff was all produced by NIH or Heart Foundation type funding, which was not a corporation. The good stuff is not coming from free enterprise medicine. The good stuff is really coming from taxpayers. It's a stunning fact about it. This tally here is no longer available. The FDA is no longer allowed to keep this. Under the Bush administration, the drug companies pressured Bush, and he ordered the FDA to stop it and take it off their website. They're not allowed to, the individuals might have private opinions, but they can have no FDA version of what's good and what's bad. So that's not available anymore. But it doesn't matter. You can see what the hell was going on, and presumably the same thing is going on today. All right? Oh, I jumped ahead, and I think I told you about this. The disclosure rules. and the registration rules. Okay? So, no, I haven't told you entirely about this. Well, I can just be quick. I told you about one of them, the last one here, the requirement of pre-trial registration, so that it's not enforced in about half the cases that actually do get published in the major journals. It's their own rule, but they won't even enforce their own rule. There are other things like disclosure rules, even though they're fairly precisely stated, people just ignore them. And there's no way the journals can keep up with it. So JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, this is the journal edited by Catherine DeAngelis. So she said that there was just no way she could police this, because she received thousands of articles, multiple authored, every year. There's no way they could track things down. You just had to trust people. And people would say, they'd just tell lies, outright lies. And if anyone caught them, they'd just say, oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I meant to tick that off. And just, you know, who knows? But worse than that, who cares? It's just a little box, that, you know, somewhere at the end of the article. Yes, I did this work for Merck. Tick, yes, Merck actually paid me once to give a lecture, and they gave me an honorarium, something like that. You know, and people just, they just disclose. It's like, well, I wouldn't say it's like Rob Ford, but it just doesn't seem to have an effect. All right. Here's an interesting case. This is a sunshine law from the state of Massachusetts. Okay, this is fairly recent. Now look at this first fact, which is really interesting. The Canadian figures are not, you can't just do the usual 10% rule of thumb, okay? The situation here is much better. But the fact that, and so you might say, well, why aren't I talking about it here? Mostly because there aren't as much detailed figures. But second, no matter what is going on in the United States, it will affect us, because practices there get encoded into the WTO rules, and then they're imposed on the rest of the world. So we have to sort of follow those practices. If we try to do something, then we'd be in violation of WTO rules, we'd be sanctioned for it, we'd be penalized in our trade relations and so on. Not that the Harper government wants to, but if a government actually was more progressive and wanted to do something, they would face that kind of problem. But look at this first fact. 70% of US physicians receive gifts from the medical industry. That's quite aside from samples. I mean, if you include samples, what's 100%? Now, Massachusetts, in a 30-month period, tallied this, here are some figures from this article here, published just last year. In Massachusetts, I don't know the proportion of physicians in Massachusetts. It probably is 70% like the US in general. It's going to be close to that. Anyway, there are a grand total of 32,000 and some payments to almost 12,000 physicians in Massachusetts, totaling almost $77 million to those physicians. That's a hell of a lot of money. Frankly, this is just bribes. These are just bribes. Okay? I mean, it's not like me coming here, and Meta, if she's really feeling incredibly generous, she might buy me a beer. In which case I would have to report a $5 honorarium. But I suspect I'm going to have to even buy my own beer, aren't I?
No.
See how I insinuated a beer out of her? I've shamed her into giving me an honorarium. All right. So anyway, it's an incredible amount of money. And for what? Well, you know, some kind of service, payment for service. So maybe I give a so-called educational talk. It can be fancy dinners. that I go to. It can be grants, it can be so-called educational gifts, or the educational gifts are particularly nice. So I might get a $10,000 educational gift from Merck, and I don't have to provide any receipts. I am to use it on my personal research, whatever I see fit. I think I will spend it on a vacation in Hawaii doing research on various medical problems, the effects of sunshine in February, something like that. Okay, so anyway, you get a lot of this crap. So what to do about it? So the Massachusetts, the state, passed this thing called the Physician Payments Sunshine Act. And what they, and its aim was simply to make all of this information public. Okay? And the thought is this: informed patients will take this into account and they'll make better decisions regarding their own health and the cost of that health. Okay? So it's just simply a typical sunshine law. I'm telling you what the facts are. You can act on it if you see fit. Will it work? It's a kind of test case for regulation. Here's a kind of regulation, and it would be good to know whether or not the public responds well. So here's what we know already. Even prior to the Sunshine Act in Massachusetts, we already know this, that the public is tremendously ignorant of almost anything, even when the information is available on the internet. So somebody was telling me just yesterday that I think even the Canadian, I don't know if it was the Canadian public or the American public, but in some survey it was thought that up to half of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid. I'm stunned if that's possible, that half the Canadian public could believe that, or the majority of the Canadian public believe that half the federal budget actually goes to foreign aid. Well, you can see, if they actually do believe that, you can see why they get pissed off at so much money going to foreign aid. The truth is, I don't know how much we give to foreign aid. It's less than 0.5%, I think.
Yeah.
Less than half? How much is it? Maybe 1/4% or something like that?
Regulated at 0.7, which was never reached.
Never reached them. But we even voted for the UN measure that called for 1%, I think, right? Many years ago. No, not even close. Nobody's even trying.
0.3.
Are we 0.3? Yeah.
I mean, other people may know more precisely, but it's...
No, but it's in that neighborhood.
Under the 0.7. That would
It's not 50% or anything even close. Yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, that information is readily available, and yet colossal ignorance of such things. And things like advertising and the advice of your physician actually trumps everything else. So you can go to the internet and read X, Y, and Z, but you're overwhelmed by advertising, and especially by what your physician says. And why does your physician say anything? Because your physician has been charmed by a cheerleader. All right. And there's also an important psychological fact about us as patients, that we're actually quite ready to believe that physicians are corrupt, but not our own. Not our own. Your physician, I'm sure he's corrupt. I don't doubt it. And yours, and yours. But mine, I love her. She's wonderful. I've had her for 30 years. I'm sure she wouldn't, she'd do anything to improve my health. I'm sure she reads those journals very carefully and makes careful decisions. And the real test is this: the Sunshine Act and things like it have no effect on prescribing behavior. People don't say, "Oh, sorry, doc, I'm not having that one. I've heard about that drug." And the doctors don't say, "Oh, I've done some research into the drug you want. You don't want it." Okay? In fact, it just goes on. The prescribing behavior is simply not changed by things like these Sunshine Acts. And it may even get worse. And here's why. These are a couple of psychological facts about human beings. Once a physician who might tell you the truth about the drugs in question, say, look, here's the real truth about it. But once sorry, not the truth about the drug. Here's the truth. Yes, I've taken money from the company that makes the drug I'm thinking of prescribing for you. Okay? Telling you that. You should be warned. Oh, maybe there's some kind of bias here. Psychologically, it turns out that when a physician has done that, the physician actually feels a little freer to exaggerate the merits of the drug. Okay? Look, there's a couple of things that apparently social scientists use as technical terms. Strategic exaggeration. I may talk about some of the problems with this drug, but once I've told you about my commercial relationship to the company, I feel, you're going to think less of the drug, so I have to exaggerate the benefits of the drug to overcome that little bit of negative impact that the facts I gave you happen. So I do this so-called strategic exaggeration. And the other thing is so-called moral licensing. Well, once I've told you that I got money from Merck or something like that. Okay, you heard me, I got money from Merck. Now I can lie to you because I've warned you. I feel morally free to tell you a lie after that because I gave you that initial heads up. Sort of, look out, I'm a liar. And now I tell you the big lie, all right? So psychologically, it's actually quite interesting. And anyway, the general upshot is that the sunshine laws are not terrific. Okay, so let me give you a kind of summary of what we've done so far. Okay, so the for-profit, free enterprise medicine, market model of medicine and so on leads to things like market failures in antibiotics. There are all these corrupting influences in the clinical trials. It leads to pseudo-health problems like PMDD that I mentioned. It skews, this one is terribly important, I think. It skews research aims toward the patentable solutions and away from other solutions like exercise and the environment. And things like disclosure rules, even though they're there, are just not effective in most circumstances. They just don't seem to be working at all. There's a couple of things about the skewed research and other kinds of solutions that are worth telling you about. There was some interesting work done on exercise recently, and well, there's actually several interesting things about it. Number one is there's not much research on exercise. That's the first thing. But there sure as hell ought to be, because what research there is really interesting and important. The next thing is that, actually, let me give you some rough figures about it. So in the case of depression, it looks like a certain amount of exercise, if you conduct a certain amount of exercise, people in the standard range of depression, we're not talking about people who are catatonic, but in just the sort of mid-level depression, that exercise will help in about a third of those cases and lift you out of depression, which is about the same rate as Prozac. So here you could have the benefits of exercise without the side effects of drugs and have roughly the same benefit from it. The second thing is what is not widely known but was revealed about 5 or 6 years ago. Prozac has no effect at all. Prozac ties a placebo. And this was learned when a British researcher, partly through freedom of information, got the results of a whole lot of trials that were unpublished. And what he did was take the published trials and the unpublished trials and amalgamate all the data, and it turned out that Prozac and a placebo are essentially tied. So for most people for whom Prozac is effective, it's really as a placebo effect. That's what it is. Now, it's a powerful placebo effect. No one should ever discount that. And in saying this, I have some reluctance, I have to admit, because I don't want to go around telling people who might be depressed and seem to be benefiting from Prozac, or any of the other SSRIs, by the way, like Zoloft and so on. But I don't know. Somehow or other, it seems that the whole business is so damn corrupt that it ought to be exposed, even at the expense of, you know, upsetting some people, and it will. But there are side effects. There are side effects to Prozac and the others that people need to seriously worry about. And often, especially when young people go on or off, they become suddenly and completely unpredictably suicidal. There are several thousand suicides due to Prozac and other things like that. It is now acknowledged by the drug companies that there are such things, but they will say, compared with the good it does, they would say, oh yes, but we solve the depression problem in so many people that we're preventing a lot of suicides, even though we admit it may cause some suicides over here. But the numbers are in favor of taking it. I remember, some of you may remember, it was a scandal in the newspapers, the U of T. Every university, every research intensive university is guilty of this kind of thing. But we got 2 black eyes in a row, and you remember them, right? Nancy Oliveri was one, and David Healy was the other one. And at the time, David Healy was preaching he wasn't actually anti-Prozac. He just said, look, there's some research we need to do on the suicide problem. And at the time, he estimated that there had been about 50,000 suicides worldwide from taking Prozac and other SSRIs. And he was fired on the spot. He hadn't even started, but he had signed the contract. He was looking for a house and good schools for his kids and all that stuff. And we fired him. There was an out-of-court settlement, and I'm sure we paid through the nose. I hope we did. And he stayed in Wales, where he is. But he's very good, and if you want to read stuff on Prozac, he's definitely worth reading. Okay, so anyway, oh, and there's more. There was another study, a very recent study, a kind of meta-study on exercise that I started to tell you about, and the effects are really quite good. This is on, not on depression, but this time on things like heart disease, stroke, onset of type 2 diabetes, and heart failure. I think they considered 4 categories, and found that medication was very good for, I think, what was it? It was good for one of the 4, I can't remember, but exercise was tied or better than for all the others. So if you have a stroke and you're recovering from a stroke, exercise is a hell of a lot better than any drug. If you want to prevent type 2 diabetes, exercise is a hell of a lot better than any drug. And we don't have enough of this kind of research. The trouble is, if anyone at U of T enters into a partnership with a drug company where the drug company pays a part of the research, you can bet they're not going to investigate exercise, because there's no IP rights to get out of it. It'll be just published on the internet. Go jogging every day and you won't get diabetes. And nobody's going to make a penny out of that. Okay. All right, so now I'm back at the end, which was the beginning, and here are the proposals. First, to eliminate intellectual property rights like patents in medical research. I'm not calling for it across the board, just in medicine. And that all medical research, including clinical trials, should be publicly controlled, publicly funded. And nobody makes any royalties. If Eli Lilly wants to do research, that's fine. We'll do the testing, and they don't get any royalties out of it. They get a public pat on the back for being good citizens, but they're not going to make a penny out of it. Okay? And there's no reason in the world why medical scientists shouldn't be like the rest of us, physicists and philosophers and mathematicians and so on, which is we work for a decent salary, and we do it for whatever reason we have. Maybe we do it for the glory. Maybe we do it out of curiosity. Maybe we just do it for the money. But it's going to be university salary and no patents. This is the way medical research was. It was completely like this up until 1980. 1980 was that's when things went sour. And they went sour because of a single piece of legislation in the US. The US introduced a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. And what it said is the following. Prior to Bayh-Dole, US taxpayer money that supported research, it came with the following requirement. Any discovery goes immediately into the public domain. You can't patent it. It's public knowledge for everyone to use. That's the old way everything was done. And then in 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. Now you can take taxpayer money, and if you discover something and you want to patent it, go ahead. You get the royalties. And the reason they did this was because they wanted to speed up the process of bringing discoveries into the marketplace. They felt that they were falling behind Japan at the time. And so this was an attempt to regain American leadership, as it were, in science and technology. And they thought this would be the trick. And it had a tremendous effect on how research was done after that. So we went from virtually no patents at all in medical research in 1979 to it just took off, and now you get thousands every year. So it completely changed the atmosphere. So this is, in a sense, just a call to return to 1979. Okay? In a certain sense, it's not quite as radical as it sounds. I wish it were, but it's actually sort of tame when you think of it like that. Now, a typical Republican, conservative, always looks to the golden past. Say, we should return to the good old days, right? That's all I am. A humble little lefty only wanting to return to the good old days of 1979. And that's all I ask for. But I'm putting it in terms that we'll all understand by calling it the socialization of medicine. And here's why. Well, first of all, there's some good reasons for it. So it would stop the outright corruption of, cheating on clinical trials and cheating on data. It would allow more rational choices in how we spend research money. So somebody could say, look, I think we should spend some money on exercise and diet to tackle problems of depression, and we'll spend some money on drugs too. That's fine. But it's not going to be skewed towards the drug solution simply because that's where profits can be made. We'll have a better vaccine policy, we'd have a better antibiotic policy, and so on. The thing, when I peddle this view, in Europe or in Canada, there's a sense in which it's actually rather easy, this last step. I say, look, I'm trying to socialize medical research. We already have socialized medicine. Think of medical research as simply a slight extension of the healthcare system in Canada. Instead of medicine just being about services to you, we're increasing it to research so that we can provide even better services to you. Just think of it as part of the healthcare system. And that's a way of roping it off from, say, research in electronics, where Apple can come along and give us new gadgets, and they're going to make royalties from that sort of thing. So I'm not calling for an end of patents across the board. Just here, where it's really important that we do that, and where it fits in very nicely in any country that's already got socialized medicine. In the US, well, you can't do that in the US. That just doesn't fly. So all I can do if I were talking to Americans is to say, it's bringing back pre-1980 medicine, which American medicine used to be really good, and it's really tanked since 1980. In fact, there's a lot of products that are actually prescribed to you that are nowhere near as good as the generics from, produced in 1942. In fact, for most people, the best blood pressure medicine is a simple diuretic that's about 75 or 80 years old. Not for everybody. This depends on the cause of your blood pressure problem. But for most people, that old, it's water, it was the old water pill. That's actually best for most people. But nobody's advertising it, nobody's promoting it because nobody can make any serious money off it. It's cheap, it's like pennies a day. It's like taking an aspirin every day. Nobody's going to make a lot of money from an aspirin a day. Okay? Now, this is more or less the end of my talk, except for one thing, which is sort of directed against anyone who has philosophical interests in this kind of thing. It's all been philosophy, but it's also been politics and a lot of other stuff too. But there's a kind of interesting philosophical problem about this. And it's about the question of what the hell is scientific method anyway, and how does it change, if it changes at all, and stuff like that. Now, I suspect, thinking about this made me think about scientific method in general. And there's a kind of high-level scientific method where we argue all the time, but it's very general and it applies all times, all places. This is sort of where Popper fights against Kuhn and stuff like that. And then there's an interesting level which is quite different, and it's quite specific to a particular area of science, and where the sciences learn facts that have themselves methodological implications. And the classic example of this is the discovery of the placebo effect. So once the placebo effect was discovered and appreciated, it was immediately realized, I shouldn't say immediately, it took a generation or two, it was realized that you cannot carry out medical research on things like drugs the way people used to. The way it used to go is, hey, I've got this new concoction, you say you've got a headache, here, try this. And I give it to a couple of my patients and they say, hey, I'm feeling a hell of a lot better. And I write up a little article and publish it in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that's the way things went. But as soon as people realize, oh no, there's a placebo effect, and it's really important here. And there's also a kind of bias in the researcher, you know, I say, you look really happy, when in fact it's just the corner of his mouth has gone up a little bit. He says, it doesn't hurt as quite as much as it used to. But I say, oh, you mean you're completely cured? And there are these kinds of problems. And when you know about these, you say, okay, we've got a control for this. And so that's when randomized clinical trials came in. They came in the early 1950s. Before 52 or something like that, there were no randomized clinical trials. It's only, here's the placebo, here's how we deal with it. So this is a major methodological change, but it's not one of these high level, it's sort of intermediate level methodological change. Okay, now I think actually when you think about how medical research is performed, namely by free enterprise medicine, and then you see these problems with free enterprise medicine, what's happening, you can advocate a change of how it is funded, how it is structured. And that's not unlike discovery of placebo, therefore switch how we test drugs. And so I'm thinking of everything that I've done tonight as in that spirit. Okay? So I didn't set out to bash capitalism in principle. Well, I didn't, sort of. But when you look at these things here, and then, you know, you discover these are the consequences of doing it in this way, so you say, okay, it's just not going to work. We have to do it in some other way, and hence the new proposal. Okay, see how it goes? So that's a kind of philosophical argument about what's really going on. But you don't have to worry about that. You could say, okay, I don't give a damn about that. I see it just as simple policy alternative. It looks like it might be a better policy, or it looks like it might be a worse policy, and just leave it at that. I don't care, frankly. Okay, that's it.